What if one of the most powerful spiritual tools was something they told you to fear? Cannabis has long been painted as a vice, a distraction, a drug that dulls your senses and numbs your ambition. But here's the thing that's not the full story. In fact, it never was. Long before cannabis was banned, it was sacred. Before it was criminalized, it was ceremonial. It wasn't used to escape life, it was used to understand it. Across many ancient cultures, cannabis wasn't revered for how it made people feel, but for what it helped them see. It was never meant to be entertainment. It was a mirror, a teacher, and a gateway to a deeper connection with oneself and the world. So why then did they turn this sacred plant into a symbol of laziness and rebellion? Why was the link between altered states and spiritual evolution severed? The reason is simple. When you're connected to your inner knowing, you become dangerous. You stop looking for truth in temples built by men, and instead you start finding it within. That kind of freedom is not something that can be taxed, tamed, or controlled. Before there were laws, borders, or governments claiming ownership over consciousness, cannabis was a bridge, a spiritual tool, a sacred guide. Ancient civilizations didn't just stumble upon this plant and decide to smoke it for fun. They recognized something in it, something ancient, something wise. Across cultures and continents, from the mountaintops of the Himalayas to the deserts of North Africa, cannabis was known not as an escape from reality, but as a key to understanding it. Take the Sardos of India, for instance. They didn't use cannabis to disconnect from the world, they used it to go deeper. Through Bhang, a sacred cannabis preparation, they communed with Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation. They didn't seek to destroy for the sake of chaos, but rather to break down the illusions of ego attachment and the false self. They weren't stoners, they were mystics. And the plant wasn't a pastime, it was a sacrament. In ancient China, Taoist shamans burned hemp in rituals designed to alter perception and enter spiritual dimensions. Archaeologists have even found traces of burned cannabis offerings in Scythian burial chambers, which were believed to be tools to guide the dead into the next world. In the Middle East, early Hebrew texts mention bosom, a plant many scholars now believe to be cannabis. It was used in the holy anointing oil described in the book of Exodus. This wasn't just a metaphor, it wasn't an accident. The plant was embedded into the very rituals that connected the human to the divine. From Zoroastrian Persia to Egyptian priesthoods and among Central Asian tribes, cannabis was part of the sacred toolkit. It was revered as a plant of insight, a botanical bridge between the material and the metaphysical. The Vedic texts of India even spoke of a mysterious substance, S, used by seers to access divine knowledge. While the exact recipe of S is still debated, many believe it included cannabis along with other entheogenic plants. The key point is this: across vastly different belief systems, people turned to cannabis not to dull their minds, but to expand them. This wasn't primitive drug use, it was elevated consciousness. And it wasn't reserved for the elites. It was available to anyone who had the courage to face their own mind. But then empires rose. Industrialists, missionaries, and power structures came with a new agenda: obedience, control, and monotheism. The gods of old were silenced, and so were the tools that brought people closer to them. Cannabis, once used in sacred rituals, was pushed out of temples and into alleyways. What was once sacred was now labeled sinful, and the narrative shifted not because the plant changed, but because those in power feared what it could awaken in you. They knew what cannabis did. They knew it opened perceptions, challenged authority, and dissolved the illusion of separation. They knew that people who connected with the divine through direct experience didn't need priests, governments, or systems built on fear. That was the real problem. There are truths buried too deep and too dangerous for most to confront, which is why we created Insights Academy, a free newsletter where we go further than we ever could here. Sign up through the link below and get a free digital copy of the Kabbalion, but only while it's still available. Here's the truth: cannabis didn't fall from grace. It was pushed, and the war on drugs. It wasn't really a war on drugs, it was a war on inner freedom. They couldn't control the experience, so they criminalized it. They couldn't profit from awakening, so they pathologized it. And now here we are, generations later, still trying to piece together what was taken from us, still trying to remember what they worked so hard to make us forget. But you're here, and that means the remembering has already begun. You've been told that the war on cannabis was about public safety, about health and morality, about protecting the youth. But that's not the real reason it was banned. That's the story they fed you to keep you asleep. The truth is, the war on cannabis was never about cannabis. It was about your consciousness. Because a mind that questions, reflects, feels deeply, and sees clearly cannot be easily controlled. And that terrified them. When governments outlawed cannabis, it wasn't because they discovered new dangers. It was because they recognized a threat not to the public, but to their own power. In the early 20th century, Western powers began cracking down on plant medicines across the board, not just cannabis, but peyote, psilocybin, ayahuasca. Anything that opened the mind and softened the ego became suddenly illegal. The timing of this crackdown wasn't random. This was an era of industrial expansion, mass propaganda, centralized education, and a growing need for obedient uniform workers. There was no room for spiritual introspection or expanded states of awareness in that model. There was only room for submission. Cannabis, with its tendency to slow down time, turn your focus inward, and provoke contemplation, was everything they didn't want you to experience. What happens when you stop rushing, stop chasing empty goals, external praise, and manufactured needs? You start seeing clearly. You begin asking questions they can't afford to answer, questions like, why do I feel empty in a system that gives me everything it says I should want? Why do I feel disconnected in a world that claims to be more connected than ever? Why do I crave silence, solitude, something deeper? And why does that feel so forbidden? The answer is this: a spiritually awakened population does not serve the interests of an elite minority. You can't sell salvation to someone who has already found it within. You can't manipulate a soul that remembers its own sovereignty, and you definitely can't control freethinkers who've experienced ego death. So they built a new narrative. In the United States, men like Harry Anslinger turned cannabis into a racialized weapon. Propaganda films like Reefer Madness didn't just misinform, they dehumanized. They linked the plant to minorities' crime and deviancy, not because any of it was true, but because it served the agenda of fear. And where fear rules, truth dies. What was once a divine connector became a social weapon. Decades of policy followed mass incarceration, broken families erased traditions, millions jailed for a plant. But no one stopped to ask who benefits from this. It wasn't about protecting society, it was about protecting the illusion. Because when you suppress direct spiritual experience, you force people to depend on institutions, religious, political, and medical, for guidance, meaning, and control. They couldn't kill the plant, so they vilified it. They couldn't criminalize introspection, so they demonized the tools that sparked it. But deep down, they knew the truth. And some of them still do. The fear wasn't cannabis. The fear was what cannabis revealed. The door to liberation is already inside you, and they have no key. So they locked you out. They wrote laws. They flooded the airwaves. They made you think spiritual tools were criminal tools. And they did it so well that even now, even as laws are slowly changing, the stigma still lingers like smoke, not because it's true, but because it works. But you were never the problem. Your mind wasn't dangerous. Your awareness wasn't deviant. What scared them was your potential, unfiltered, unplugged, and untethered. No system built on control can survive that. Most people think of cannabis in terms of its effects: getting stoned, feeling relaxed, or maybe paranoid. But that's surface-level thinking, the kind the system wants you to stay trapped in. Because once you understand that cannabis doesn't give you something, it shows you something. You realize it's not just a chemical experience. It's a consciousness experience. It's a mirror, a magnifier, a portal, not to escape the world, but to see it clearly, raw, and unfiltered. But here's the kicker: the real magic doesn't come from the plant alone. It comes from how you meet it. When you use cannabis with reverence, it doesn't just alter your mood, it alters your relationship with yourself. It pulls you into the present moment with a force you can't ignore. Those mundane thoughts start to melt away, and a different kind of awareness emerges. You start noticing the pauses between your thoughts. You begin to hear silence as if it's speaking to you. The distractions fade, and what remains is something most people run from: yourself. Not the version you show to others, but the deeper self, the raw self, the unresolved self. And that's why cannabis can be so uncomfortable. Because when used with intention, it doesn't numb, it reveals. It shows you where you're out of alignment, where you're performing instead of being, where you're suppressing instead of feeling. You might feel anxiety not because the plant caused it, but because it unmasked the anxiety you've been carrying under the surface all along. And that's the power of sacred use. It doesn't always feel good, but it always tells the truth. It can dismantle the ego, not destroy it, but help you see how it operates. The stories you tell yourself, the labels you cling to, the identities you build around survival instead of truth. The plant sits you down and gently says, look. And if you're brave enough to look, you can start rewriting the narrative, not through force, not through intellect, but through presence. Many spiritual traditions speak of ego death, of surrender, of dropping into the now. Cannabis, when paired with practices like breathwork meditation or even movement, can serve as a guide into those states. But it's not the destination. It's the lantern lighting the path. You still have to walk it. When you enter that space with intention, everything changes. Light becomes more alive. Sound becomes more resonant. Your body becomes a tuning fork, and your thoughts slow enough to actually listen to. That's where insight comes, not from thinking harder, but from softening, surrendering, and allowing. Yet most people never reach this place because they treat cannabis like entertainment instead of ceremony. They chase the high but miss the teaching. They turn it on to tune out, not to tune in. The difference is subtle but life-changing. The first dulls the mind. The second awakens it. The plant doesn't care what you wanted. It reflects what you bring. Bring intention and you get revelation. Bring noise and you get confusion. That's why setting and mindset matter. If you use cannabis surrounded by screen stimulation and distraction, don't be surprised if it just amplifies the chaos. But if you meet it in stillness, in silence, in reverence, it becomes sacred again. This is what the ancients understood. They didn't use cannabis every day. They didn't use it casually. They used it in specific moments with clear purpose to break through the fog of illusion and remember who they were. Not to escape life, but to return to it more present, more grounded, more connected to the pulse beneath the noise. That's the invitation cannabis extends when you approach it with consciousness, not to get lost, but to find yourself. And the deeper you go, the more you realize it's not about the plant. It's about the presence it awakens. Cannabis can be a key, but like any key, it can also become a cage. And that's the part too many people avoid. It's easy to romanticize the plant, to place it on a pedestal and call it holy. But if we're honest, not everyone uses it to awaken. Many use it to hide, to numb, to avoid the very work the plant is meant to support. And that's the danger, not the plant itself, but the intention behind how it's used. A sacred tool used unconsciously becomes a trap. A medicine turned habit becomes poison. You've probably seen it, the person who lights up every day but hasn't moved forward in years. The person who talks about awareness but avoids the mirror. The person who gets high to disconnect from anxiety instead of listening to what the anxiety is trying to say. When cannabis becomes a default instead of a decision, something shifts. The ritual turns into routine. Insight turns into inertia. And the user becomes a prisoner to the same cycles they once hoped to break. This isn't judgment, it's a reminder. Because the system wants you to use the plant this way. The same forces that once criminalized cannabis are now capitalizing on it, packaging it, branding it, stripping it of its spirit, and selling it back as a lifestyle. Not a sacrament, not a ceremony, but a product. Another consumable in a world addicted to escape. They don't mind if you use cannabis as long as you don't wake up with it. They'll give you edibles, vapes, gummies, and flashy dispensaries. They'll hand you dopamine hits in sleek packaging curated for your comfort. But what they won't give you is context. They won't tell you that cannabis is a mirror, not a mask. They won't tell you that its purpose was never to help you avoid your pain, but to walk through it. They won't tell you that it can amplify unresolved emotions and unprocessed trauma, not to punish you, but to reveal the work still to be done. When used carelessly, cannabis can reinforce illusions instead of shattering them. It can make spiritual language sound profound, while your actual life remains unchanged. It can create the illusion of progress without real transformation, a false sense of peace, a synthetic kind of presence. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between insight and sedation. That's the line we must walk between reverence and responsibility, between use and misuse. Cannabis will meet you where you are. It doesn't discriminate, but it also doesn't lie. If you use it to bypass your inner work, you'll feel stuck. If you use it to deepen that work, you'll feel pulled into clarity. It's not about quantity, it's about quality, it's about consciousness. The truth is any tool, no matter how sacred, can become a distraction when the intention behind it is lost. In today's world where burnout is constant and silence feels foreign, it's tempting to turn to cannabis not for revelation, but for relief. But relief is temporary. Awakening is permanent. And cannabis was never meant to be a shortcut to enlightenment. It was meant to be a companion on the path, not the path itself. We have to stop pretending that the plant will do the work for us. It won't. It can show us the door, but we still have to walk through it. It can amplify the truth, but it can't force us to live it. That's our responsibility. That's the difference between using the plant and being used by it. So ask yourself honestly, am I using this to connect, to escape, to grow, or to drift, to see? To blur the edges of what I already know is asking to be seen? The plant doesn't judge, but it also doesn't rescue. It reflects. And sometimes that reflection is exactly what we need if we're willing to look. Something is shifting. You can feel it even if you can't always name it. A restlessness, a hunger, a quiet refusal to keep living in shallow waters. The world is loud with distractions, yet more people than ever are turning inward, not outward. And along with that shift has come the return of something ancient, something once buried beneath propaganda and fear. The sacred use of cannabis is finding its way back into our lives, not as a form of rebellion, not as a trend, but as a form of remembrance. Spiritual seekers across the globe are coming back to the plant, not to escape life, but to engage with it more honestly. We've entered an age where practices like breathwork, meditation, and fasting sound healing, and plant medicines are no longer seen as fringe practices. They're becoming essential tools for navigating a collapsing culture. And cannabis, once demonized and dismissed, is finding its way back into the center of spiritual practice. But this isn't about nostalgia. It's about necessity. Because what we've been told about reality is breaking down. Systems are failing. Institutions are losing trust. The old ways of finding meaning through status consumption and blind faith no longer satisfy the soul. And in that emptiness, many are waking up to an ancient truth: direct experience is the most sacred teacher. And for thousands of people, cannabis is becoming part of that experience. When used consciously, cannabis isn't a break from the spiritual path. It's a catalyst for it. In small doses, it can quiet the chatter of the thinking mind, allowing something deeper to emerge. It can loosen the grip of identity, soften the armor around the heart, and open doors you didn't know existed. It won't drag you through them, but it will show you what's possible. And when paired with intention, meditation, stillness, movement, or prayer, it becomes something more than a plant. It becomes a guide. This isn't just a theoretical idea. Around the world, conscious communities are forming around the intentional use of cannabis. Microdosing for meditation, cannabis-enhanced yoga ceremonies, circles, where the plant is used with prayer and presence, not performance. These aren't stoners looking for a better high. These are seekers reclaiming an ancient practice with modern awareness. We're seeing a shift from quantity to quality, from intoxication to exploration, from coping to connecting. People are realizing what cannabis was always meant to be: a tool, not a lifestyle, a doorway, not a destination. And with that shift comes responsibility. As the plant moves back into sacred space, it must be met with sacred intention. Not dogma, not rules, but awareness. The goal isn't to get high, it's to get clear. And sometimes clarity is uncomfortable. Sometimes it means facing the things we've buried under noise and busyness. But if we allow it, cannabis can help bring those things into the light. This is what the resurgence is really about. Not liberal policies, not trendy dispensaries, but spiritual sovereignty. People want their inner world back. They want tools that bring them home, not pull them further into distraction. Cannabis, when remembered and respected, is one of those tools. It's not about going back in time. It's about bridging what was once known with what's being rediscovered. Ancient wisdom isn't lost, it's dormant. And cannabis, like other sacred plants, is one of the signals that awakening has begun. Not because the plant changed, but because we did. We're no longer looking to escape the world. We're looking to rebuild it from the inside out. And if the system fears that, good. Because a society built on inner knowing, deep connection, and spiritual clarity cannot be manipulated in the same way. It can't be sold the same lies. It doesn't run on fear, it runs on truth. There's a reason they want you numb. a reason they push distraction entertainment and endless scrolling while bearing anything that leads you inward. Because when you're disconnected from yourself, you're easy to guide, easy to shape, easy to sell to. A person who hasn't met their inner truth will chase any external one that's loud enough. And that's exactly how the system likes it. Noise over knowing, consumption over connection. It's not just about cannabis. It's about everything that offers you a glimpse beyond the veil. Anything that threatens to dissolve the illusion of separation between self and spirit, human and divine thought and awareness, becomes a threat to control. That's why for decades they didn't just criminalize cannabis, they erased its spiritual roots. They removed it from ceremony, mocked it in the media, and linked it with laziness and failure. Not because it was weak, but because it was powerful. They knew that when people start tuning in instead of tuning out, things change. Priorities shift. Obedience fades. People begin to see how artificial the world around them has become. And worst of all for them, those people stop playing by the rules. Because rules only work when you believe the game is real. But what happens when the game itself is revealed as a distraction? What happens when people realize the chase for approval, for status, for external success is hollow? That's when systems collapse. Not from violence, but from disinterest, from refusal, from people choosing presence over programming. This is why the war on inner experience is so effective and so dangerous. It's subtle. You weren't told not to feel. You were just constantly distracted from doing so. You weren't ordered to avoid silence. They just made it almost impossible to find. The attack isn't overt anymore. It's ambient. You're surrounded by stimulation, tempted by endless dopamine hits, and praise for staying busy, plugged in, distracted. And when you try to reconnect, you're called lazy, unproductive, indulgent. But here's the truth they won't tell you: the more disconnected you are from your inner world, the more valuable you become to theirs. A spiritually disoriented population is a marketer's dream. It's a voter's goldmine. It's the backbone of a culture that profits from your discontent. If they can keep you chasing validation, success, even wellness, they don't have to worry about you waking up. And that's why cannabis is dangerous. Not because of its chemistry, but because of its potential to break the loop, to slow you down, to crack open the shell you didn't even know you were living in. Used with presence, it invites you to feel again, to remember what stillness sounds like, what your body actually needs, what your soul has been whispering beneath the noise. A person who reconnects with themselves becomes unpredictable. They stop needing the system in the same way. They don't consume to fill the void. They question why the void was there in the first place. And that's the real threat. Not rebellion, not revolution, but radical reconnection. You weren't born disconnected, you were taught to be. Taught that silence is empty, that rest is weakness, that slowing down is dangerous. But the danger was never stillness. It was what stillness reveals. Because once you see the game for what it is, you can't unsee it. You stop chasing. You start creating. And the systems built on your obedience begin to lose their grip. Cannabis used intentionally helps people wake up. And that is exactly what they fear. Most people never learn how to use cannabis properly because they've never been taught to see it as anything more than a recreational substance. Light it up, zone out, laugh, sleep. That's what they show you in films and memes and the culture built around it. But when something has the power to open your perception, dissolve your ego, and bring you face to face with your subconscious, it deserves more than a casual approach. It deserves respect. It deserves ritual. Without intention, cannabis is just another high. But with it, the plant becomes something else entirely. A tool for transformation, a bridge, a portal. It starts before you even take the first breath. Ask yourself why you're using it, not as a throwaway question, but as an anchor. Are you looking to numb something, to amplify something, to receive, to release? Intention is what separates medicine from addiction, insight from confusion. And the plant knows the difference. Ritual doesn't have to be religious, it just has to be conscious. Turn off the distractions, set the space, silence the noise that demands your attention all day long. This isn't about candles and incense, although those can help. It's about energy clarity, choosing to treat the moment as sacred, rather than something to pass the time. Whether you're alone in your room or sitting under the stars, make it known, this is not about escape. This is about remembering.